I want to preface that I'll be discussing topics of sexual assault, suicide, and depression. The answer to saving a dying society is compassion. On average, 130 people die of suicide each day. And let's be honest, thoughts and prayers simply aren't enough. Saving a life requires action. Saving a life requires radical compassion. The original definition of compassion is sympathetic pity for the suffering or misfortune of others. Pity for the suffering of others. I personally do not want pity in my suffering. I want resolve and refuge. Many people see compassion as just something we feel, a type of emotion. But that's wrong. Well, partially. We experience emotions on what psychologists call the 90-second loop, meaning that when you feel something, it takes 90 seconds for our brains to complete that chemical reaction. What we do after those 90 seconds, that's up to us. When we feel compassion toward a person, we must take action to help them. Otherwise, we're just feeling pity for people and going on about our day. And that version of compassion is futile for mutual sustainability of human life. We are beings of connection and community, and that is the essence of compassion. We need to challenge the fundamental nature of compassion to include action. We need radical compassion. Unfortunately, I had to experience what is before understanding what should be. 8 days into my freshman year, I was sexually assaulted by a Villanova football player. I had already seen what happens to women who pursue justice. Whether it be victim blaming or slut shaming, there is very little compassion for the victimized woman. There is even less for the victimized Black woman. As a first-generation college student, I feared that speaking out would endanger my education. I knew as a society we often fail to provide adequate resources and support to victims of trauma. I knew that mental health and victimization weren't seen as real issues. These aspects forced me into a corner of silence and repression. I thought I could just move on, but unfortunately, that's not how trauma works. Despite presenting a facade of normalcy, I was actually struggling with panic attacks, haunted by flashbacks, and developed a protective shell around myself in response to the assault. The more I tried to pretend, the harder it became. Eventually, my veneer cracked, revealing the shell of who I once was. 30 pounds lighter, emotionally unstable, and imprisoned by fear. I became a hollow version of myself, and those around me were just left with the shell. When presented with someone who is suffering, society points us towards conventional compassion. Send a supportive text message, drop off some comfort food, bring some self-care items, distract them with fun activities. While these are all kind gestures, they do not include understanding. During my suffering, these felt like band-aids and fueled a sense of hopelessness as I felt nothing could help me. There is a difference between a kind gesture and an act of radical compassion. An act of radical compassion challenges us by asking, what can I do to ease the reality of this person's suffering and promote their healing? In order to change one's reality, we must first know what that reality is. And because suffering is a result of trauma, understanding the basic effects of trauma guides the impact of our compassion. This brings us to the first element of radical compassion: understanding. By having a basic understanding of the effects of trauma, we can target our approach to be more meaningful. To make this simple, we are going to think of trauma as having three layers. First, the root event. Second, the fundamental effects. And third, the manifestations. Trauma is defined as an experience that threatens a person's life, safety, well-being, or overwhelms their ability to cope. The fundamental effects of trauma include internalized beliefs and chemical and physical changes of the brain. Yes, you heard me right. Trauma literally changes the way a person's brain looks and functions, specifically areas that control memory, rationality, and emotional processing. A traumatic event can also cause a person to internalize negative or destructive beliefs about themselves or their environment. Before getting assaulted, I never doubted my inherent worth. But after the assault, I struggled with intrusive thoughts of worthlessness. Enabled by the chemical changes of my brain, that belief seeped into every thought process I had. The manifestation layer refers to how these chemical changes and internalized beliefs manifest outwardly. During my suffering, I lost 30 pounds due to not eating because I felt worthless. On the surface level, the problem seems to be me not eating because I don't have an appetite. But from a trauma-informed lens, we look at the superficial and then ask why. The effects of trauma are often interconnected and not immediately apparent. And what we see on the superficial is often an indication for something occurring at the fundamental. By investigating and addressing the fundamental effects of trauma through radical compassion, we can have a much more profound impact. Without this, the other elements of radical compassion cannot exist. Without this, compassion is futile, and I'm speaking from personal experience. According to the National Council of Behavioral Health, 70% of adults have experienced at least one trauma in their lifetime. That's 223.4 million people who don't need pity. That is 223.4 million people who need understanding. That's 223.4 million people who need radical compassion. I've experienced the judgment, fear, and hopelessness that fills the space compassion should have. I remember the silence of individualism. I remember the way my soul ached for understanding. I remember the sting of loneliness. That is what a lack of radical compassion felt like. And that is what drove me to attempt suicide the morning of October 21st, 2021. I had already taken a handful of pills and was just waiting to die until a picture fell from my wall. It was a collage of my sister, my mother, myself, and our guardian angel. Seeing that picture reminded me of the pain I felt when my father died. I remembered the fundamental effects his death had on my life and my family. I remember how insufferable it felt. In that moment, my suffering paused and was replaced with the memories of my family's suffering. I wanted to escape my suffering, not redirect it. So I called for help. Surviving my attempt was the best thing that ever happened to me. Yes, for the obvious reasons. But it also allowed me to understand what I was seeking. I was seeking what I felt towards my family. I was seeking radical compassion. Being through what we have been through as a family, there were times my mother could not pour into us because of the emotional burden she was carrying. So we poured into her. There were times she failed to meet our expectations because of her trauma. So we always forgave her because we understood it was not her direct fault. I understood the nuanced reality of her suffering because I was going through a similar one. I understood that I had to be selfless in my support of her because she could not do it alone. I'm extremely imperfect, extremely. So by no means am I saying I am the perfect model of radical compassion. But in that moment, when I looked at that picture, it was compassion that saved my life. It allowed me to understand that the people and places I found refuge and resolve in were those that provided me with the 8 elements of radical compassion: forgiveness, understanding, selflessness, effort, passion, consistency, imperfection, and honesty. We all have expectations of those in our lives. And when someone is suffering, their focus switches to trying to preserve themselves. They may fail to meet your expectations, or they may act out of character. Forgive them for the effects of their trauma. Forgive them because someone once forgave you. Forgive them because they are human. Radical compassion cannot exist alongside resentment. Seek to understand the 3 layers of trauma for those you aim to support. Radical compassion requires genuine understanding. Through that understanding, we must also be selfless. Radical compassion is not transactional. Radical compassion is effort through action. It's showing up and not giving up. The fuel behind not giving up is passion. We must have a passion to see those around us thrive and support them in getting there. Through this process, we must also be mindful of our own mental health, which is why honesty is integral. We must be honest with ourselves and those we aim to support about what we can and can't do. By being honest, we build trust and provide a clear image on what to expect. As with all things, consistency is key. Healing does not occur overnight or with one act of radical compassion. We cannot have a timetable for those we want to help. The most important of these elements is imperfection. We are imperfect beings and cannot expect anything we do to be perfect, including our compassion. Our acts of radical compassion may sometimes fail, or we may realize something we could have done better later on. And that's okay, I promise. There is no step-by-step guide on providing radical compassion for those around us. Connection and community are the essence of compassion, meaning that we must actually do the work. We must find how we can integrate these ideals into our lives and practice them daily. Every person's approach to radical compassion is going to be different because we all navigate life differently. By embodying the ideals of radical compassion as a part of our personhood, the step-by-step flows naturally and becomes innate to each of us. This is what I call radical compassion, and this is how we mutually sustain human life. Thank you to everyone who has helped sustain my life. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for your radical compassion.